There we go. Perfect. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I welcome everybody to our morning, or I guess afternoon webinar. My name is Scott Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. As you might be able to tell from my surname of Miller, I'm a Scottish, sort of English-Irish heritage. And while I was born abroad in Europe, I've kind of been raised in Treaty 6 since I was under a year old. So I live just east of Wetaskiwin in a place where my parents settled, and I've lived there for almost 46 years, which seems like a really long time until you compare it to the generation upon generation of Indigenous people who have lived here for such a long time. So my history in Canada is only 3 generations old, from when my grandparents settled in Canada, and I'm just beginning to seek out my own how my own history intersects with colonial history, and so I'm exploring that and learning as I go. In a spirit of respect and reciprocity, we acknowledge that the lands within the watershed of the North Saskatchewan River are in Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. And these lands are the traditional territories and the traveling routes and the gathering, the gathering places of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, the Métis, the Dene, the Stoney, and the Nakota Sioux. And we recognize the contributions of Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and whose rich histories, cultures, languages, and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward as treaty people. So the NSWA recognizes that the role of watershed management and people who practice watershed management, that we recognize the role of that system and these people in perpetuating a colonial system that has often and typically excludes or ignores the perspectives offered by Indigenous culture and science. And we make this statement as an affirmation that we're committed as an organization to improving the practice of watershed stewardship. And I invite you all to recognize in your own way this land that we're on, and learn and grow so that we may together advance reconciliation. And so if you'd like to enter in the chat box, the treaty or the traditional territory from which you're joining from today, that would be very much appreciated, and we can understand a little of the audience that's joining us today. As I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, and I'm your host for today. This is my first Watershed Wednesday. I was just recently brought into this position just a couple of months ago, and so it's my pleasure to welcome in this sort of fall series of Watershed Wednesday webinars. This is an NSWA sort of online speaker series. Today's webinar is the first of 3 being held today, with the rest being one in November and one in December. We have a number of staff and board members joining us online, and I would encourage both staff and board members to pop their names into the chat so that people know who all is in attendance from the organization. The theme for today's webinar is really got a pretty strong October feel. We're hearing about bats from Cory Olsen, and we're about bugs from Dr. Heather Proctor. Both of our speakers will be sharing their knowledge, their experience, their expertise about some various bat and bug species within the watershed. For a little bit of housekeeping, we're dividing the session into 2. We'll have 1 speaker in each half of the webinar. There'll be a little bit of time for questions in between, and we encourage you to put your questions into the chat as we go. And we have a couple of folks, Kayla and Jill, kind of monitoring the chat for those questions, so we'll make sure we don't lose them in the chat box. We would like you to keep your video off and your microphone muted just so we can maximize the bandwidth. We're going to ask, I'm going to go back one slide actually. We're going to ask a couple of poll questions during the webinar today, and we're going to start with this one. So Jill, if you could pull up the poll question, the first poll question, that would be appreciated. So the first poll question is really simple. If you can just take a second.
Sorry, I just think I need Elisa to do the poll, if that's all right.
I've got it going. You're good.
You got it? Oh, perfect.
Just give it another 30 seconds or so. You should see a poll question up on your screen, just asking what sector you represent. Oh, at the moment, it looks like NGO organizations are in the lead. Another 10 seconds. You'll need one more answer and we'll have a full slate. There we go. I'm going to end the poll. All right, so it looks like we have a pretty nice cross section, missing a few folks from the provincial government and from some of our Watershed First Nations and Indigenous communities. But as I say, NGOs have the lead. So it gives you a sense of who we have in the room with us today. Thank you. All right. So that voice you just heard from the ether, that was Jill. She's helping to run some of the logistics of the webinar behind the scenes. And Kayla is providing some support as well as other members of the NSWA staff. Jill is one of our Watershed technicians, and she has the challenge at the end of the webinar of randomly picking somebody from our participant list to receive a custom NSWA gift basket that has some pretty much one-of-a-kind or almost one-of-a-kind NSWA swag. So stay tuned at the end of the webinar for the winner of the gift basket. Obviously, we're recording. The recordings will be available shortly after the webinar online. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel or also check out our website for a bit more information. I will make a plug right now to sign up for our in-stream newsletter, which carries sort of monthly tidbits from the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. Now for the part that you're all here for, which is not to listen to me. Our first presentation today is about wetland and riparian management for bat conservation. And our speaker is Cory Olsen from the Alberta Community Bat Program. Cory is a professional biologist. I will stop sharing right now and leave it to Cory to share his screen, and I'll continue his introduction. So Cory is a professional biologist who's been studying bats for over 14 years. He's authored several reports on bat management in Alberta, and he surveyed bats from across Western Canada. He's currently the program coordinator at WCS, Canada's Alberta Community Bat Program, which has been working to prepare the province for the arrival of white nose syndrome, and I'm sure he'll get into some of those details. His recent work has been focusing on using genetic analysis of guano collected at bat roosts to address some knowledge gaps that we have with regard to bats. He's visited watersheds all across Western Canada to collect samples, and typically he's visiting bridges. So that's where bats like to hang out. And he's going to discuss the implications of the project for bat management and the importance of wetlands and riparian areas for bat conservation. Welcome, Cory, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I assume you can see the screen and hear me?
It's looking good.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me for this webinar. I am Cory Olsen, Program Coordinator for the Alberta Community Bat Program. This is a project of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada that we began in 2016. You can find more information on our program on our website, albertabats.ca. We have lots of information to answer questions about bats and to learn more about bats. And we have numerous free guides and brochures that can be downloaded to address various topics related to bats. We have a guide on managing bats in buildings, which is very important for their conservation. We have a guide on building bat houses, and we even have a coloring and activity guidebook, which is very appropriate for this time of year. And that is available for free on our website. And if you go to our website, we also have links to our social media accounts where we provide up-to-date information on what's going on in the bat world. So if you want to learn more about bats, follow us on social media, and there is a ton of information available there. To begin this presentation, I'm going to give a very brief overview, some background information on bats. There are 9 species of bats in Alberta, at least 9 species, and there are about 18 in Canada as a whole. Only British Columbia has more species of bats than we do here in Alberta. It is useful to divide this group into 2 groups based on how they are surviving the long winter months. That's an extremely challenging time for bats, and they have to have adaptations for surviving our very long winter. So the first group, which consists of the eastern red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat, they are leaving Alberta entirely during the winter to find milder climates farther south into the United States, or maybe even Mexico, or they're heading west towards warmer areas along the coast. Those 3 species are also the ones that are most often found dead at wind energy facilities during fall migration. And fatalities at wind energy facilities is a topic of a whole nother conversation. The other 6 species in Alberta are presumed to spend the winter here in the province. In most cases, we don't exactly know where bats are going during the winter. We do know of a few caves, such as Cadman Cave and Wapiabi Cave, that support hundreds or upwards of a few thousand individuals. That doesn't account for very many of our bats. So for the most part, we don't know where bats are spending the winter. But we do think that they are spending the winter here in Alberta. Just because they're spending the winter doesn't mean they don't migrate. They're still undergoing movements that can range well into the hundreds of kilometers between their summer and their winter habitats. Of the 9 species that occur in Alberta, 8 of them, all but 1, occur within the North Saskatchewan River Basin. Only the western small-footed myotis won't occur in this region. They're restricted to southern Alberta, where they are found in close proximity to badland habitat along rivers and the adjacent coulees. Alarmingly, 5 of the 9 bats we have in Alberta are either already endangered, such as the little brown myotis and northern myotis, or they are undergoing status assessment for potential listing over the next few years. So to have 5 of our 9 bats having at-risk designations is rather alarming, and it reflects an overall deterioration of the conservation status of bats across North America. Oh, I will also mention, little brown myotis and northern myotis are endangered because of white nose syndrome, which is a disease of bats that has been spreading over the last 10 to 15 years. And eastern red bat, hoary bat, and silver-haired bat are undergoing status assessment because of concerns surrounding mortality at wind energy facilities that is believed to be unsustainable. Bats are not like birds or small mammals like mice. One of the key differences is that they live very long lives and they reproduce very slowly. Most bats in Alberta only give birth to 1 pup per year, and not until they're 2 or 3 years old. And to make up for that, they have to live long lives. We know in Alberta there was at least 1 banded individual that was observed 38 years after it was banded, and it was still alive. We are now into October. This is the very last month that you would expect to see bats active during the warm period of the year. There are occasional flights of bats in Edmonton and other urban communities year round, but those are big brown bats, which sometimes hibernate in buildings and take winter flights. October is the very tail end of the summer activity period. Starting around late July, they start to congregate, at least the adults, they congregate near their hibernation sites, and they engage in something called swarming, which is a polygamous mating session where many bats gather and mate. By the time bats go into hibernation, they've already mated. The female stores sperm and then ovulates in spring, at which time she is pregnant. So when they arrive at their summer breeding grounds around April or May, the females are already pregnant. They give birth around the middle of June to early July, and then about a month later, those pups can begin to fly on their own. And then it's a race to accumulate enough fat before the onset of winter so that they can survive the 6 months of the year without food. I should mention different bat species have slightly different behaviors. Not all bats engage in swarming, but that's a topic for another day. And I don't want to discuss managing bats in buildings, but for a couple species here in Alberta, how they are managed while they're in buildings is extremely important to their conservation. We know that a lot of little brown bats in particular will reproduce in buildings, and how they are managed is very important. And I won't go into the detail, but the important part is that they are not disturbed during the summer activity period or during the summer breeding period when the pups are still dependent on their mother. So we're trying to encourage everyone to avoid disturbing bats from about June to the end of August. And even better would be to wait until they leave for the year. That information can be found in one of our brochures that we released not too long ago, which is the Beneficial Management Practices for Pest Control Operators. It has updated calendars and timing recommendations that'll start to appear in some of our other guides going forward. What I do want to talk about, though, is the retention and conservation of natural habitat. All of the buildings and bat houses in the world will not help bats without healthy environments to support them. And I think it is important, before we go into detail, to understand what bats need for survival. Like all animals, they need access to food, water, and shelter. And they need safe access to those resources, which is a major challenge for protecting bats. We know that wind turbines kill many bats, especially during fall migration. We know that cats kill many bats. These are a non-native species for which bats have few defenses. And entrapment of bats is a major concern, whether it be in chimneys or ducts or vents or rain barrels or other structures. We know that entrapment of bats kills thousands per year. All of the bats in Canada eat nothing but bugs. So it's very topical to have a presentation following this one on bugs. All the bats are eating nothing but bugs. And by that, I mean insects and spiders. And it's mostly insects that are flying or active at night. Bats can glean insects from the surfaces of vegetation, but most of what they're eating are insects that are out flying at night. Moths are a really important food source, and various semi-aquatic insects are also very important. Mayflies, midges, mosquitoes, lots of different insects. Most bats are generalists. They'll eat what's available in their environment. And so having rich, diverse food sources is really important for sustaining their energy needs throughout the summer. And one point I would press is that bats have huge appetites. During the peak of summer, they need to eat about their own weight in insects every single night. And they need to eat even more in the fall when they're fattening up for winter hibernation. So to provide a suitable foraging habitat for bats, it's not sufficient to just provide a little pond or a few remaining trees in the landscape. They need vast tracts of vegetation and productive wetlands for supporting their dietary requirements. And they need to survive about 6 months of the year without food. So what they obtain during the summer and fall is really important to their winter survival. And bats need shelter. For a couple species, they will roost in buildings. They're not building nests, so there's no such thing as a bat nest, but they do need safe, warm roosting spaces. Naturally, a lot of the bats in Alberta would have roosted in old, dead, or decaying trees. And where they're available, a lot of the bats would have also roosted in rock crevices, such as along river valleys or in the mountains. And a few bats, or most bats actually, will roost on bridges to some extent, which I'll discuss here shortly. And bats need access to water for drinking. They do not land to drink. So for them to have access to water, they need clean, still water that allows them to fly just over the surface where they dip their mouth into the water to take a drink. And it's not enough to just have those resources in their environment. They also need to have those resources configured in such a way that they can efficiently and effectively move between them. So commuting habitat or migration habitat is really important to the overall effectiveness of their environment. Bats can cross large openings, so they could, most bats could fly across this canola field in the lower panel, but most bats are going to be flying along treed edges. So what we would actually expect to happen is that most bats in the lower image would be flying along the tree line that you can see in the distance. So the field itself is not terribly effective bat habitat. Some bats, like the hoary bat, they're more adapted to flying in openings, so you might see them being more venturesome, but most of our bats are going to be sticking close to treed corridors. Riparian areas are really effective for that. Riparian areas have easy flight corridors along the river and shelter provided by the adjacent vegetation. In this panel, you can see that this is high quality bat habitat. There's access to lots of trees for roosting. There's water for supporting insect communities, and they can easily access drinking water. So this is effective bat habitat. This is in the northern boreal forest where there's lots of insects for eating. This scene is more typical of the aspen parkland. You have lots of land lost to cultivation. But there are still trees. There's lots of trees along shelter belts. And in this case, there's a water course that has trees along its margins. So in this case, we would expect bats to fly along the edges of the field and along this, this water course. In this case, in this image, it's a little bit less clear that this is effective bat habitat. There's no trees that provide shelter for commuting. There is water, which bats could access and feed over, but there's not suitable shelter. So this would be less effective bat habitat. If we were wanting to enhance the habitat for bats, we might consider allowing some of that vegetation to regenerate, especially the shrubs and trees that would probably have occurred in this landscape. And it's not hard to scan over or through the aerial imagery and see that a lot of the vegetation along our rivers and creeks has been lost or degraded. This is really important for bats because in some areas, most of the bat activity, certainly a disproportionate amount of the bat activity, is occurring within the riparian area. There was one study in southern Alberta, granted where there's fewer trees than here, but almost all of the bat activity there occurred within 1 kilometer of the river. You might also see high bat activity around large ponds and lakes, but for the most part, most bat activity is occurring right up next to the river. And we would expect that here too, where even where we have more trees here in the aspen parkland, a disproportionate amount of the bat activity is concentrated or will be concentrated along the river. When we're thinking about how to help bats, then when we're thinking about how to help bats, a lot of us think about bat houses. Certainly when we look at our search results for our own program, it's very clear that the first thing people think about when they want to help bats is to put up bat houses. And those can be a great structure to help provide habitat for bats, but they also have some limitations. And perhaps the most important is that only 2 of the bats we have in Alberta actually use bat houses to a significant extent. And that's the little brown bat and the big brown bat. The little brown bat is an endangered species in Alberta, but both the little brown bat and the big brown bat are two of the most common species we have in the province. So bat houses are helping an already common species. And it's the same bats that use buildings that will use bat houses. They are really effective for helping to mitigate the consequence of evicting bats from buildings. But it's more debatable whether we should be encouraging them to move into natural areas. Bat houses not all bat houses will provide benefit to bats. A lot of the ones that are sold at hardware stores and greenhouses do not use a suitable design to help bats. But they are a great education tool, and in an area where there's already lots of human disturbances, they can provide effective roosting habitat for little brown bats and big brown bats. But an overlooked option, when we think about how to help bats, rarely do people think of the wetlands and the riparian areas that support them. Beaver ponds are one of the most important habitats for bats. There's easy access to roosts for trees for roosting. It supports productive insect communities and access to drinking water. And often when we're talking about bat conservation, it's with the same people that quite often have to drain beaver ponds within parks and natural areas and other areas where they create problems with flooding. But there is another feature along riparian areas now that I would like to talk about a little bit more. This is a feature that has been overlooked in a lot of situations for supporting bats, and that is bridges. Bridges cross some of the most productive bat habitat there is, which is rivers. So it's not surprising that bats will have learned to use them for roosting sites. And up until we began our project last year, we really had very little idea of how often bats were using bridges. So these are a representative sample of bridges that you would encounter in Alberta. A lot of these are concrete, and concrete bridges are perfect for bats because they stay warm at night when they most need a warm surface to roost on. And bridges have another benefit, which is that they're widely dispersed throughout the country. Whereas buildings used for bat roosts tend to be concentrated in the developed regions of the province. But bridges are widespread and they're all on public land, which is easy to access. So for monitoring bats, bridges are perfect. Last year, we began a survey of bridges across Western Canada. We've already inspected over 700 bridges, which is a large number, but there's still thousands more that we haven't been to. And what we found is that some of these are used for maternity colonies, such as this one. So this is a bridge using a box beam design. The beams, where they come together, create this narrow channel that is just about perfect for supporting bats. And for some of these bridges, if you look inside, usually well overhead, you will see something like this, which is a little brown bat maternity colony. These can consist of hundreds of bats, and maternity colonies are groups of mothers that come together to raise their pups. Each mother only has one pup, but collectively they can number in the hundreds. Or you might see just a solitary bat, such as this big brown bat tucked away high up in between the beams. But there is another way that bats are using bridges, and that is as a night roost. So night roosts are locations that bats are roosting, but only during the night between feeding bouts. And by having a warm surface to roost on, they can save energy by not having to keep warm, or by more effectively keeping warm. And they'll stay there and digest their meal. And before they leave, they'll poop out, which leaves their guano behind, which is perfect for use in genetic analysis methods. So from that guano, we can determine species, and we can also monitor for disease, including the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. So this is a bridge we sampled. This is way overhead, but we have a telescopic pole where we could scrape the guano that stuck to the side of the bridge. So there is a close-up view of the guano stuck to the bridge. And if you were to go out to some of these well-used bridges at night, you would see something like this, which are bats roosting on the exposed beams, digesting their meals. So we collect a sample of that, we send it for DNA barcoding. And we're just now getting some of the results of that. And I won't go into detail because I think I'll run out of time and be ushered off of the conference call, but I'll briefly summarize some of the more interesting stuff. So these are observations or detections of one species, the long-legged myotis. This is a bat that's very poorly understood in Alberta. We don't have great information on where it occurs or what habitats it's using. But as you can see here, we've had multiple detections of this species outside its known range. And right now we think it could go all the way to Edmonton. So this data is helping to refine our understanding of geographic ranges of bats. Going forward, it will help us to understand changes in bat occupancy across the landscape. And we're also sending samples from many of our bridges for testing for the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, Pseudogymnoascus destructans. We haven't gotten our results for this year back, but this is a summary of our results for last year, where we found this fungus for the first time in Saskatchewan. This fungus was introduced in New York over a decade ago, and it's been spreading state to state and province to province ever since that time. So through this project, we've confirmed that it's in Saskatchewan, and we suspect it's very close to the Alberta border currently. Well, that's all I have time to discuss. So hopefully I didn't go too far over the time limit. I can answer some questions, and I just want to thank all the supporters of the project. There's too many to list, but we have them on our website, albertabats.ca/about. Thank you.
Thanks, Cory. That was, I learned a ton of stuff, and I know there was a couple of questions that got posted in the chat because I put at least one in there. I'm going to call on Kayla to ask, sort of randomly pick one or maybe two questions out of the chat to cover off, and we'll do our best to try and answer all the questions, perhaps in a written format afterwards. We'll give them to you, Cory, and you can maybe provide a bit of insight. Kayla?
Yeah, for sure. So we do have some questions. One from Cassie, where they ask, are the genetics in bats that migrate further away more diverse than ones that do not migrate as far? And do they tend to come back to the same areas?
Yeah, so the long distance migrants, the hoary bat and eastern red bat, they have done some genetic analysis from across the continent, and it's just one big panmictic population. So there's lots of genetic diversity, but there's no genetic structuring at all within the population, because they're essentially breeding with bats from all across the continent. For the others, I'm not really sure. There would be some genetic structuring, or there has been another study on Western small-footed myotis, where they find that there is quite a lot of genetic structuring along the coulee systems. So each section of a coulee is basically a matrilineal line where it's the mothers and their descendants along the female line.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah, hope that answered Cassie's question. And then another one, we'll probably have time for two more maybe, but I'll take Jill's question of, are bats at greater risk from wind farm fatalities than birds and other species? And how would they be, if so?
Yeah, so a large proportion of the fatalities from wind farms are bats. And most alarmingly is that it's only of mostly 3 bat species. So whereas birds, it's spread across multiple different species. So fatalities at wind turbines really is an issue of bats, less so with birds. In the case of birds, there are some issues around species at risk like ferruginous hawk, but for the most part, fatalities at wind farms is an issue with bats. And silver-haired bats and hoary bats account for more than all of the songbirds combined under some metrics of calculating fatalities.
It's really interesting. Do we have time for one more question, Scott?
Actually, I think we'll switch over to the poll and then
Awesome.
we'll move on. But thank you very much, Cory. That was a fantastic presentation. So our poll question has to do with bats, and we'll give just a few, under a minute for this, but it's what is the oldest known, the record for the oldest known bat in Alberta? It's looking a lot like people were paying attention. Give it another 10 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to end the poll here. And I'll share the results. So lots of people are saying 38 years, which is correct, right, Cory? That's little brown myotis, banded catamine cave. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So that was from a banding study that that occurred in the 70s and 80s. And then a few years ago, a live bat with that band was observed.
So what's the record for the oldest bat?
I believe that's 40. I had it in I think it's 42 years old, and it's a species of myotis in Russia, I believe.
Excellent. Thank you. That was fantastic. All right. So knowing time is ticking, let's move on to our next presenter. So Heather, I'll get you to pull your presentation up. So our next speaker is Dr. Heather Proctor. She's a native Albertan. She grew up in Edmonton and St. Albert. She did her undergraduate degree at the U of A, and her honors supervisor was Dr. Hugh Clifford, a freshwater ecologist who specialized in mayflies or Ephemeroptera. Hugh let Heather select the taxonomic focus for her undergrad thesis, and so she chose water mites, Hydrocarina. More than 3 decades later, she is still working on water mites, amongst a few other freshwater and terrestrial invertebrates. And she's had positions in Ontario and Australia, and she's returned back to the U of A in 2002. And she teaches courses in organismal diversity, including freshwater invertebrate diversity. Heather, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Just want to find out, can people see both me and the talk up here? Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm just going to hide the floating meeting controls. All right. So I was told this was supposed to have a bit of a Halloween theme. I may have gone over the top on the Halloween stuff. So hopefully you won't find it too egregious at the end of the program. But first, just a little bit about me. Is that right now, there I am, standing in the North Saskatchewan, just a little bit earlier this year. I'm currently teaching Zoology 351, which is freshwater invertebrate diversity, in which students make their own collections of freshwater invertebrates and identify them. It's worth quite a proportion of the mark for their course. So they are very eager to get out into the North Saskatchewan watershed and elsewhere to collect critters for their course marks. Okay, and I may have aimed a bit low because I really wasn't sure of the audience here, and my apologies if you roll your eyes at, yes, we know what an invertebrate is, but just to make sure, there are lots of things that live in aquatic habitats, freshwater habitats, and that includes many groups of eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So we've got bacteria in freshwater and lots of eukaryotic organisms, including animals, plants, fungi, and protists. If you do collections in freshwater, sometimes you may collect protists that are almost the same size as small invertebrates or even larger than small invertebrates. So we need to realize that our focus for this talk is not going to be on protists, but it's going to be on animals that are not vertebrates, so invertebrates, and that's more than 95% of all animal species. So sorry, long-nosed dace, this is not about you, but it's about your food to some extent. Initially, I'm going to provide an overview of freshwater invertebrate diversity, sort of at the phylum level. Then I'll talk about why would we care about surveying or understanding invertebrate diversity. And then I'm going to have 4 focal taxa that I chose for the theme of scary little suckers. So freshwater have every major terrestrial taxon, plus a few that don't occur on land. So there are some phyla present in freshwater habitats that do not have terrestrial representatives. So bryozoans, moss animals, sponges, and cnidarians are present in freshwater, but not on land. In contrast, however, there are a great many phyla that live in marine habitats that have no freshwater representatives, including things like echinoderms. They do not have freshwater species. Oh, and as a note, as this is being recorded, anything with JH on it is from this excellent photographer, Jan Hammerski. So how did freshwater invertebrates get into freshwater? There's several routes of colonization. Some came directly from marine ancestors, like crayfish are descendants of lobsters, basically. And it's thought that they were ancestrally trapped in a lagoon that was closed off from the sea and gradually became fresh. But there are other marine organisms that sort of gradually evolutionarily moved up estuaries or moved up into freshwaters through groundwater. But a surprising abundance of freshwater species of invertebrates are actually from terrestrial ancestors that secondarily became aquatic. So the largest group of snails that we have in the province, pulmonate snails, insects, and most aquatic mites are from terrestrial ancestors. Just a quick survey going through phyla with freshwater representatives here. Oh, and by freshwater, I'm not meaning actual freshwater in the sense of not being very saline. I'm meaning non-marine waters. And of course, many non-marine waters, including in Alberta, can be super salty rather than actually being fresh. So some non-triploblastic animals, in other words, animals that don't have 3 tissue layers in their bodies. We have sponges in Alberta, porifera. Surprisingly common, but easily overlooked because they mostly just look like brown or greenish blobs and get mistaken for algae or general detritus. We've got one free-living family of cnidarians in Alberta, the family Hydradae. There's some hydras down here. In Eastern Canada, there's a species that has both a polyp form like hydras and a jellyfish form. That like is swimming through the water column. We do not have that here yet, but who knows, it may come. And I'll talk about some other cnidarians later in this talk. Then we move into the phyla that have all 3 tissue layers, endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. Lots of flatworms, platyhelminths, large ones like Dugesia, and tiny little microturbularians that you might mistake for actually being protists. We also have an awful lot of freshwater flatworm or parasitic flatworms in Alberta, and Michelle Gordy, if she is here, can tell you all about those. In freshwaters, we also have nematodes, the roundworms, both parasitic and free-living individuals. Nematomorphs, horsehair worms, I'll be talking more about them later. Gastrotrix, which are tiny critters that are less than a millimeter long. Rotifers are also tiny critters less than a millimeter long. Here's a rotifer. And nemerteans, ribbon worms. Most of these are marine, but there are a few freshwater and terrestrial ribbon worms. And the first ribbon worm ever observed in Alberta was actually collected by a Zoology 351 student. And we only periodically, every few years, someone collects another one of them. And we don't actually know what species it is. Also in Alberta are some moss animals, bryozoans. Vast majority of these species are marine, but there are some freshwater ones. Here's my favorite one, Cristatella mucido, really beautiful freshwater bryozoan. They're also easy to overlook because most colonies are small and again, look like little bits of brown muck. But you find their overwintering stages and dispersal stages, these things called statoblasts, are really commonly found in samples. So they probably are almost everywhere. We just haven't explored them very well. For segmented worms, we have a lot of oligochaetes, one of which I'll be talking about later, and lots of freshwater leeches like this Glossophonia here, very few of which are going to be ones that bite humans. Most are predatory rather than blood feeding. We don't have any polychaetes definitively known from Alberta, but there might be some from underground waters in the southern part of the province. In Alberta, we have two classes of mollusks. The most species rich is the class Gastropoda, the snails, with 7 families, well, 6 or 7, depending upon your taxonomy, and about 40 species. Bivalves, the clams / mussels, are not that diverse. We've got only 2 families and not very many species of them, but the unionid mussels, this is the outer shell of one here, are the largest freshwater invertebrates in Alberta by mass. We have lots and lots of tardigrades, but they are seldom collected. They are also very, very tiny, but they're super tough. Probably everybody knows that tardigrades can survive being in outer space and also being dried up for decades and then coming back to life again when you add water. Of course, they were never really dead in the first place. They just had essentially no metabolic activity. Then it's the arthropods that we have the greatest diversity of. That's the dominant group in inland waters. And in fact, within that, it is the class Insecta that is the most diverse. There's 95 families of insects that have aquatic representatives. Most of these are aquatic as larvae, like dragonflies and damselflies, and aerial as adults. And there's a few like Chryxidae, water boatmen, where both the juvenile and the adult stages are aquatic or subaquatic, or semi-aquatic rather. And then crustaceans are the second highest in diversity, known diversity, I should say, in Alberta. This includes relatively few large-bodied crustaceans. We only have 1 species of crayfish compared to the dozens in, say, eastern US states, and the 100 or so species found in Australia. What we have in Alberta in vast numbers, though, are freshwater amphipods, commonly called scuds. We've got 2 genera here, and they can include, can occur in massive numbers. If you've ever sampled for freshwater invertebrates, you know that you can sometimes get like a kilogram of scuds in your net, which is annoying if you don't want scuds. Cladocerans and copepods, cladocerans like Daphnia, are very common and diverse. And ostracods, which are seed shrimp, are also abundant and diverse, but we know very little about their species identity. The last 2 groups of arthropods I want to talk about are arachnids. There are a few species of semi-aquatic spiders like Dolomedes that are distributed in the province, and many species of mites. Especially the water mites, the Hydracnidia, are often noticeable because of their relatively large size and bright coloration of many taxa. How do we actually know what freshwater invertebrates are present in Alberta? The grandfather of this was Dr. Hugh Clifford at the University of Alberta. As you heard from the introduction, he focused on mayflies, Ephemeroptera, but he was interested in all freshwater invertebrates. And he eventually summed up his knowledge in this book from 1991, Aquatic Invertebrates of Alberta. He was very specific about calling them aquatic because he didn't want to suggest that all water bodies in Alberta were actually freshwater, but I'm more relaxed and I say freshwater when I actually mean fresh and saline. Hugh taught invertebrate zoology and the freshwater invertebrate biology course from 65 to 95, and was awarded a couple of honors for his high quality of teaching. And this comes through in the quality of his book as well, because he has made it very easy for even non-invertebrate biologists to understand how to identify invertebrates through his use of flowchart keys. The book is now out of print, but it is extremely popular and is sold for very large amounts of money on eBay and Amazon. However, I have good news. A scanned version of this book is freely available. And if you want to go to it, I would suggest taking a photo of this screen right now, or perhaps I can apply or provide this in the chat later on, because it's just available for you to look at online. Why would you bother studying freshwater invertebrates? Lots of reasons, including fish biology. Fish eat invertebrates, and it's nice to know their gut contents. Recreational fishers also want to understand the invertebrates as well, for this behavior of fly fisher people of matching the hatch. Fly tying to match what's hanging around at the time is big business. Of course, we all know about ecological assessment and biomonitoring, including the Alberta Biological Monitoring Institute, which does wetland monitoring using invertebrates. Certain invertebrate taxa can reflect the health of a habitat with healthy water, scare quotes, typically having a high diversity in many taxa that are sensitive to disturbance or pollution. There are many biomonitoring programs across the world that use freshwater invertebrates to assess aquatic habitat health. Ecotoxicology is another reason to study freshwater invertebrates, both because some invertebrates can accumulate toxins or heavy metals in their tissues, and also they can be subjected to toxins or heavy metals or hypothetical toxins to find out at what point of the concentration of said chemicals is too high for their survival. Conservation, areas of high invertebrate endemicity, such as springs, are often targets for conservation. And also we can use invertebrates to assess the success of rehabilitation. So here's East Pit Lake, just north of Wobman. It used to be an open pit coal mine and is now a really fantastic place to go collecting freshwater invertebrates and fishing. On the negative side, most biting flies are those that have aquatic larvae, and aquatic snails are hosts of trematodes that can be problematic as parasites of humans, wildlife, etc. Paleolimnology is something we can do, and testing general ecological theory. Trophic cascade theory came from freshwater studies, basically. And of course, we can also just collect and look at freshwater invertebrates because they're amazing and interesting. Now, hopefully I've got enough time to segue into 4 featured fiends, and yes, the heavy Halloween point here. Stealthy stabbers. 2 families of hemipterans that occur in Alberta are sit-and-wait ambush predators that are capable of killing fairly large invertebrates. Bellistomatids, giant water bugs, can kill fish and eat them, and by liquefying them with their powerful enzymes. This one actually killed a small turtle, and they, in certain parts of North America, they're known as toe biters, and this particular video was actually testing how bad that would feel if you got bitten by a toe biter. I can tell you, being bitten by a different type of hemipteran, a back swimmer, super painful, and they liquefy your tissue right at the site of the bite. So don't do that, please. We've got 1 species of bellistomatid in Alberta. They are big critters. We also have at least 1 species of nepid in Alberta, water scorpions, very similar biology as bellistomatid. And the one that we have here is the slender-bodied one, Renatra. This is a sort of surprise, because when Clifford wrote his book, this family Nepidae was not known from Alberta. The first record in Alberta, to my knowledge, was 2006, way down south. I personally first saw it at Long Lake, right around here. And these current iNaturalist observations also were around 2016 as the first start. And now we see that Renatra is in various places in Alberta. Keep your eye open for Renatra. So Scott, do I even have time to finish my talk? Am I allowed to go a little bit over?
Absolutely. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. I don't have too much more here. Second group here, I want to talk about water mites. Water mites are also fluid feeders. They liquefy their prey and their hosts' tissues before feeding on them, sucking it up. Water mites are unusual in that they are parasitic as larvae and predatory in their post-larval stages. There's an awful lot of species of water mites in Alberta. We don't know how many for sure. Their life cycle is complicated. The adults lay eggs that hatch into larvae that search for hosts. host insects typically. They parasitize the hosts for a certain amount of time, feeding on liquefied tissues and hemolymph. Then they drop off, they go through a pupa-like stage, come out as an active predatory deutonymph, another pupa-like stage, and then the active predatory adults. The active post-larval stages prey on insect larvae, eggs, and pupae, small crustaceans, and other water mites. They can be very, very fierce and will attack animals much larger than themselves. This one's attacking the larva of a diving beetle, and they can do this because of this way of feeding, of liquefying the tissue and sucking it out. They don't have to swallow big prey. As larvae, they parasitize almost all families of aquatic insects. Chironomids are particularly popular hosts. This one's decorated by many, many larvae of water mites. Here's a mosquito that has water mite larvae on it. Other hosts of water mite larvae include amphibians and potentially snails. And parasitism is typically most or limited only to larvae, but there are some taxa in which the deutonymphs and adults are also parasites, feeding on tissues of mussels and snails. And these guys here recently discovered parasitizing newts. This poor newt mouth is chock full of nymphal and adult water mites. On the other hand, water mites are rarely eaten by fish. The red species are particularly distasteful to fish and other vertebrates. They're sometimes eaten by insects, particularly insects that are like Renatra here, which feeds by liquefying tissues and sucking it in rather than swallowing. And other water mites are also predators of water mites. So this Renatra here from Narrow Lake, I wanted to photograph this water mite and was sort of annoyed when the Renatra ate it. But turnabout is fair play. Here is a Renatra feeding on Corixid, and it in turn is being fed on by many larvae of Hydracna. Nematomorphs, Gordian worms. These get their name from the ancient Greek story of the Gordian knot, which was very difficult to untie. And this is because adult worms, which can be very, very long, often form mating tangles where you don't know how many worms are in there and where do they start and stop. Another common name is horsehair worm, and this is because they were once thought to arise from horsehairs that fell into water. Horsehair worms are very wiry. If you pick one up, they look like they might be slimy, but they're stiff and wiry and have a very interesting way of moving. They're almost entirely freshwater, which is unusual for phyla of anything, with 326 freshwater species. Adults can get up to 1 meter long. We've got a couple of families in Alberta, but we don't know how many species they are. Adults of the phylum Nematomorpha do not feed. They don't have any gut at all. All the feeding happens before the mature adult is present. The adults lay eggs in water. The eggs hatch into these weird looking parasitic larvae. The larvae are sometimes directly eaten by the final host, but sometimes they just burrow into or are eaten by a transport host where they don't develop, but that transport host is eaten by the final host, and then the horsehair worm develops in that final host. Usually the final host is a terrestrial insect. When the worm matures, well, basically grows slowly in the insect, occupies almost the entire body cavity of the insect, then it somehow causes the insect, maybe making it feel thirsty in some way, messing with the insect's brain, making it run into water, very famous jumping into the swimming pool video there. And at that point, the mature adult worm breaks out of the intermediate or of the final host and swims off into the water. One study found that crickets infected with Gordian worms were 20 times more likely to jump into water than uninfected ones. And Japanese trout during nematomorph season was up to 60% these crickets that had jumped into the water with nematomorph worms in them. So that makes it sensible that nematomorph worms might have a way to get out of fishes after being eaten when their hosts jump into the water. And this study found that nematomorphs, after they come out of the host, if they're eaten by fishes, they can crawl right out of the fish's mouth, out of the gills, or out of the mouths of frogs, which is pretty cool. All right, the last one I want to talk about are a group of cnidarians called the Myxozoa. They're very, very tiny protist-like organisms that were actually originally thought to be protists and have only been identified as being animals and being cnidarians via molecular methods about a decade ago. Many, many species of them, most of which we don't know much about at all, except for those that cause problems in economically important fish. In Alberta, we should be well aware of the presence of whirling disease in salmonid fish. It's caused by Myxobola cerebralis, which is a myxozoan parasite of fish and of tubificine oligochaete worms. It causes this very bad deformation of the fish and typically death. So whirling disease was first reported in Alberta in 2016 in Banff. It's been found many other places since then, but to my consternation, nothing seems to have been reported since 2018. So I don't know if this program has stopped. And the very last one, and I know I've gone over my talk here, are this other group of cnidarians, Polypodium. It's an endoparasitic polyp that lives inside sturgeons. And not just inside sturgeons, it lives inside the eggs of sturgeons. And somehow they invade the developing sturgeon eggs in the gonad. And then when the eggs are laid, the polyps break free and walk about the river base, and then some will get into a sturgeon again. So this is not a Halloween treat if your caviar is infected with cnidarians. And so at that, I will just end with two other jokes that dragonfly larvae are scary because they always wear masks, which is only a joke if you know that that's called a mask. And thanks for your attention. Sorry for going over time on this.
Absolutely no problem. And I think I'm sort of set for my Halloween. Ugh. Thank you very much for that presentation. I suspect we could go so much deeper on the topic of both bats and inverts. So Jill is actually going to scan through our chat to see what questions have popped up. Jill, is there any questions, one or maybe two questions we can pose?
Yeah, for sure. So one from you, Scott. Do communities of invertebrates shift over time in response to changing climate conditions, or maybe as an indicator of water quality or health?
Yeah, definitely. Climate is obviously going to be important both in affecting the rainfall and air temperature and water temperature. Oxygen is a very limiting resource for aquatic invertebrates in general, and especially those that require, well, because oxygen dissolves better in cold water, so there's always more oxygen available in colder water. And as climate's warm, those invertebrates that are more sensitive to low levels of oxygen will decline for sure. And also in the more, like, say, non-climate change process of transformation of a water body, over time, standing water bodies will change in their own structure, and the invertebrates that live in there will also change in a natural way.
I guess that's a good segue into my question about how the invert populations are doing in Alberta. Have we seen a significant drop in certain species populations?
Well, that would be a great question for the people from the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, and who are actually recently, I passed on a question to them about mayfly populations. And my gut feeling is that sadly, no one monitors things at the population level long enough for us to really know that at the provincial level. The ABMI would be the best people for that, but they monitor only standing water bodies. They only monitor wetlands. There's no riverine monitoring for them, basically because their goal to cover the entirety of Alberta in a grid, rivers just don't behave properly. They're not located conveniently in almost every little grid square. So that's unfortunate. My answer is I don't know, but it is interesting that we're seeing taxa move into Alberta that have not been present before. The increasing distribution of the northern crayfish, Faxonius virilis, is one thing that people are paying attention to. Everyone notices when there's a crayfish, especially when it ends up in a place that hadn't been before, like Banff recently. found a crayfish up in the headwaters there. And it can be of great concern because crayfish are very messy and like eating macrophytes and making a big mess of things. But on the other hand, they're good for large fish to eat. We'll have to watch and see what happens with crayfish as they move through Alberta, whether they're going to be a pro or a con.
I know they are kind of considered invasive in certain areas of Alberta.
Yeah, they're native to
expanding.
they're native to the Beaver River drainage in northeast eastern Alberta, but have only moved through Alberta since Hugh Clifford wrote his book, actually, because when he wrote his book, he said that the only freshwater invertebrate of really great conservation concern was the northern crayfish because it was so restricted. And now you can find it in St. Albert ponds, in various ponds in Edmonton, all over the place, as people just like moving them around.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Heather, for the presentation and for fielding a couple of questions. We have a couple of things left. I know we're a little tiny bit over time, but I wanted to give Jill the chance to call out the name of our gift basket prize winner. So go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, so Cassie, you are our winner for the gift prize. If you want to email me or message me in the chat with your email, or just stay on after and we'll get your contacts. Although I do think I might have your email somewhere.
Thanks, Jill. So the last comments I'll make, you see up on the screen that we have 2 more webinars in this fall series, November 2nd and December 7th. If you signed up for this webinar, you will have also registered for those ones as well. But please be sure to share the information about the Watershed Wednesdays with your colleagues or people who you think would be interested. It's very much appreciated from the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. It helps us sort of reach audiences with some of these interesting topics. In November, we'll be speaking about fish populations, including sturgeon, Lake Sturgeon from the North Saskatchewan. And in December, the topic is aquatic species monitoring. So be sure to sign up or check us out on our webpage. So with that, I will return everybody to their regular day. Thanks for joining us for the Watershed Wednesday put on by the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance.